Okay. Separately, I spoke about two parts about when is the right time to harvest grains for matzah, and in short, it came out, excuse me, that seemingly the halacha points to doing a specific way. The minhag is to do it at a different way, which seemingly would be against what the din wants us to do. And one of the arguments made there was that a minhag overpowers this halacha. The fact that everyone does it a certain way tells us we can keep doing it like that, even though the technicalities of the din would tell us we shouldn't be doing it like that. So that brings us to a bigger question. That's a bigger question, which is not really connected to matzah per se at all, which is, can a minhag that's more makel than a halacha, so to speak, override what the halacha says? Okay, so I can't obviously talk about all the details of that. I'm going to give just an overview about that. There's lots in the Steichemet about this and others. I'm just going to give you somewhat of an overview of that. I like this. And it starts as follows. There's Yerushalmi and a Masechta Sofrim, similar to a Gemara's, but a Yerushalmi and a Masechta Sofrim that says the word minhag mavatal halacha. And some people have the minhag as the wording of that phrase is minhag oiker halacha. So there's a Maharik who says it means literally. If you have a minhag that was established by Rabbanim, or seems to be followed by lots of people, you should do it, even if it contradicts a known halacha. Now, this Maharik comes in layers, and that's like this. He starts with a quote from Pri Chadash, a short tshuva from Pri Chadash, who's talking about why is it that there's a minhag that people dance on Simchas Torah. But the question is, there's an issue to dance on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Okay, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. We know actually Rabbi Goyen holds like that. Some don't nowadays, but Rabbi Goyen holds like that, like others do. So he says this. So why do we have this minhag? Everybody does this thing. They dance on Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is Yom Tov. What are they doing dancing? We're not allowed to dance on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So he says it's a well-established minhag to do that, and it's okay because it's covered HaTorah. Now, if you would just hear those words from Rabbi Goyen, then you would say doesn't mean that just because it's a minhag, it could be a din. You would say there's different ways to understand what he's saying. One way would be maybe he's just saying a minhag could be a din. Maybe he could say that in a case like this. This is what the Be'er Sheva says. He says when it's an Issur D'Rabbanan. Dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov is just an Issur D'Rabbanan. So maybe that's all he said over here. He didn't talk about the Shiloh of the Deraisa. Or the way Rav Vosner says he says that maybe all Rav Goyen meant is not that because it's a minhag, therefore we could do it even though it's against the din. Maybe the Goinim had a Kabbalah that the Issur to dance doesn't apply in cases when it's a Kavod HaTorah. He's not saying that Kavod HaTorah and a minhag is the fact that there's a din. No, they knew that there was no Issur in dancing in the first place in cases where it's Kavod HaTorah. So maybe that's what Rav Goyen meant. That's what we could definitely think that he means one of these kind of answers. Okay. Now, before I go on, I do have to tell you that Rav Goyen himself, in the same tshuva, Rav Goyen says that there was a different minhag people had in Simchas Torah. He says that you shouldn't do because that's against the din. Okay, so again, that's telling us that Rav Goyen seemingly didn't mean to say you could do any minhag you want to that goes against the din. No. It was a very specific to this case for some reason why it should be okay rather than being general. That's what you might think if you just saw Rav Goyen by itself. But the Maharik brings rayas that he thinks that any minhag could override a din. Okay, as long as this is an established minhag and there was some kind of rabbinic support or citation of this minhag, and not just random what people are doing. Okay, and he brings several rayas to this. One is from the Gemara in Tainis that says Rav let people say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh with a bracha. This is before it became common. He let people do that, even though he held that it's a bracha levatala. It was a minhag. He let people do it. Another is a Gemara in Yevamah says that we follow a minhag of how you do chalitza. Even if Eliyahu Hanavi would tell us to do differently, we would keep doing chalitza the way we're doing because that's the minhag is to do it that way. The Gemara Menacha says talks about how to leave the space between the paragraphs of a mezuzah. Again, that the minhag to do it is a certain way, which would be against seemingly the din, and we do it so we could do it like that. We could do it anyhow. Okay, now, I'll mention that in this in the second raya that I mentioned, which is the raya about Eliyahu Hanavi coming and telling us, the Gemara says we would do the minhag of how to do chalitza even if Eliyahu Hanavi taught otherwise. So they bring that the Rambam in the Hakdama to the Pirush Mishnayos specifically says different shot in that Gemara. He says that Gemara, the reason why the Gemara says it is not. It doesn't mean is because the minhag is against the truth. he meant is because the Elyo Navi over there was functioning as a Navi rather than a halachic authority. So Elyo Navi coming, it's not that he's going to reveal the din. He's becoming as a Navi. So what a Navi says can't contradict the din based on a Nevuah. It has to, Leiba Shamayim, and therefore he can't contradict it. So it has nothing to do with a minhag going against a din. It's a minhag versus something min Hashamayim. So he's not talking about this at all. Okay, now, so that's Maharik's rayas, or several of his rayas, that a minhag can be Iker Din. So he says, Rav Hai, that's what Rav Hai meant. He meant that the minhag could be Iker Din, even go against the din. Now he says, wait a second. He says, but look, if you look at the Masech Sofrim that this is all coming from, it says, minhag she'ein le'rayim min ha'Torah, eino ela k'toy b'shuk chatas. That sounds like a minhag, you ignore a minhag when it goes a mistake. So the Maharik says, no, that's only in cases where there's no poskim bringing this minhag. And that's what it means, minhag she'ein le'rayim min ha'Torah. Of course, it doesn't have a right. No minhag has a right in the Torah. It means the poskim Torah, meaning in the corpus of Torah literature, it doesn't bring it down. But if poskim bring it down, like for example, he says, like Rav Hai mentioned this minhag of dancing on Simchas Torah, then we shall follow the minhag, even if it goes against the regular rules of Psak Halacha, what we would usually say. Now, Rav Hai brought some rayas. As I mentioned, he brought a couple of rayas from Gemaras, and the Pri Chadash says, no. The Pri Chadash disagrees with the Maharik. First of all, he says is, several of the Gemaras that I mentioned are going in the Shita of Rav, and the Pri Chadash says, is that that is a specific Shita of Rav. He brings a Gemara in Tainis that says three Amoraim say the exact same din, each one in their own little different way, and he says that's because Rav, it's only Shita of Rav who holds that the minhag could be a din, but everybody else does not agree with that. Others do not agree. So those Gemaras, some of the Gemaras that the Maharik brought are not a raya because they're within a Shita of Rav, which we don't hold like. He says is some of the rayas that he brings we could read different. There are other ways to read those Gemaras, and he says also I have rayas from Gemaras that a minhag should not be used to be Iker a din. He brings a few Gemaras. I'll mention one of them that, as Yerushalmi says, is and others like the Rush brings it later on. The Yerushalmi says is that when halacha refefes biyadcha, then halecha har minhag. Okay, but in other words, it's only when there's a shaila what to do. We don't know is it right to do this or this, then we follow the minhag. But a minhag that goes against the din, no, we don't follow the minhag. When we know what to do is we don't follow the minhag. We only follow the minhag when we're not sure. So we say, oh, we're not sure what to do. So then the minhag could help us figure out what to do. Okay, now, so these are the two bigger the so to speak the two sides from the beginning of it, so to speak. There's Maharik saying that a minhag could be Iker Din, and the Pri Chadash saying no, it's not true, and he disagrees with the Maharik specifically. Now, the Ramah in a tshuva argues on the Maharik, and he says a minhag can only be Iker Din if it's either one of three things: either if it has to do with a financial matter, or if it's a chumrah that doesn't have anything, no downside to it, just being machmir. So the minhag wants to be machmir, you could do that, or it's a minhag that all yidden do. Okay, and the Ramah brings rise to each one of these examples. One comes from a Rif, and two other ones come from Gemaras. That if it's either a financial issue or it's something that's a complete chumrah, or it's something that everybody's doing, that's a case when you could follow the minhag against a din. Otherwise, you can't do that. Okay. On the other hand, the Magen Avram seems to say, like the Maharik, and he's basing on a Ramah in Shulchan Aruch, who says don't ever make fun of a minhag or try to undo a minhag. The Ramah is talking about banging for Haman, and the Magen Avram seems to say over there seems to say that it's because he holds like the Maharik that a minhag could be Iker Din, but the Biur Halacha brings from a whole group of Achronim from the Chasam Sofer, the Pri Chadash, and the Rivash. The Pri Chadash I just mentioned, the Chasam Sofer and the Rivash, who say no, it's not true, and that a minhag can't use the minhag. Excuse me. To to be a din. Chasam Sofer, in a different place, the Chasam Sofer says, it happens to be the Chasam Sofer says that if there's some kind of a makar, like a non-Talmudic makar, like a Zohar, then okay, then you could follow the minhag, but otherwise you wouldn't do. Okay? And the Rosh Hashanah says that if you have a minhag, which is connected a din, he says is you should. This is in your day. The Rosh Hashanah says you should ignore the minhag, except if it has to do with an Issa D'Rabbanan, or if it goes like some Shita Yechidah. So then you say, okay, the minhag is to pass like that Shita. But if it's just going flat out against the din, then we should not be samach on the minhag. Okay? So back to the case we had been talking about, is that if you say that a minhag could go against the din, that was just, again, I did it pretty briefly of the different possibilities over here. If you could say that a minhag could go against a din, a minhag could go a din. If you could say that a minhag could go a din, could go against a din, so then even if the right time, so to speak, would be to harvest the grain at the earlier stage, the minhag would be not like that. Or a compromise to that is to say is the minhag would tell us that it's justified to be samach on the milt staka, who argued on the Rashba, or you could use wheat, which is just shmur mishas techina. That also could be good enough. So that would be like an in between. And those who say that a minhag cannot be used to be oiker a din, where the clear din in a certain way, so they would say is no. The fact that people are doing it, so they're doing the wrong thing, and the fact that they have such a, so to speak, minhag to do that doesn't mean anything, and there would not be a justification for harvesting later on.